of our proceedings today and the webcast. I also would like to remind you that virtual participation is allowed according to the procedures established by our committee. Now, on our agenda, within the framework of the fact-finding mission on Italy's commitment in the international community to promote human rights, so we have the hearing of activists who are advocating for human rights in Iran. I'd like to thank you for being available to be with us this afternoon, and I'd like to especially thank Dr. Parisa Nazari, intercultural mediator representing Women, Life, Freedom Italy community, Dr. Pegan Mushirpour, consultant and activist for digital and human rights, and lawyer Shadi Alizadeh, representative of the Italian-Iranian Union for Donna Vita Libertà, Dr. Zara Tufik Azri, who represents the Association of Free Women in Iran, and finally, Dr. Parnia Ganati, representing the Associazione Donna Vita Libertà. About a year ago, 5 days after turning 23, the young Iranian of Kurdish origin, Mahsa Amini, was arrested because she had worn the hijab incorrectly, died after detention of the so-called moral police. This was an anniversary that we marked a few days ago. There was a lot of violence on the part of the Iranian security forces against those who wanted to come together to recall Mahsa's death. And even the father of the deceased girl was arrested, and he was compelled to refrain from celebrating or from holding any ceremonies. Now there's been a movement of citizens, and of course, they are standing up for their fundamental human rights. Iranian authorities responded to this wave of protests with arbitrary protests, arrests, extrajudicial executions, and persecutions. There was even an attempt to poison, and actually there was a poisoning of several schoolgirls. And today, as pointed out by the most recent report of the Independent Committee of the United Nations, the Islamic Republic of Iran is intensifying its repressive action also through the introduction of norms that further limit the rights of women. In particular, there is a law now being examined by Parliament in Iran, which provides for many more violations, including detentions for women who violate the compulsory obligations to wear the veil, and also proposes harsher sanctions, including the ban to travel, the confiscation of vehicles, and so on. In a statement released on behalf of the European Union on the 15th of September, the High Representative for Foreign Policy, Joseph Borrell, once again urged Iranian authorities to eliminate in law and practice all the forms of discrimination against women and girls in public and private life, and also reiterated the firm opposition of the EU to the death penalty, especially condemning recourse to the death penalty when it comes to protesters who should instead enjoy full freedom of expression and gathering. The EU has also increased the list of individuals subjected to sanctions because they've been responsible for grave violations of human rights in Iran. Today, the list includes 227 people and 43 entities. I'd like to point out that in the presentation of the candidacies for the Sakharov Award 2023, which is assigned every year by a European Parliament, the group of the European People's Party candidated Mahsa Amini and Iranian women to this post, whilst the groups of Democratic Socialists and Renew Europe put forward as a candidate jointly Masa Amini and the movement called Donna Vita Libertà, Women, Life and Freedom. This, I think, confirms the broad political commitment also in the European Parliament to the cause and the legitimate aspirations of the Iranian people, and especially the women. This confirms the fact that throughout the world there is greater solidarity against the Iranian liberticide regime, which also involved our Parliament with a resolution that was unanimously approved by the Foreign Affairs Committee in 2022, and different initiatives that saw the active involvement of the members of said committee. So now that I've given you a background, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Nazari in order for her to speak to us. Of course, many people are going to be speaking, so I would like to ask you to very kindly keep to 7 or 8 minutes each. Thank you.
L'ho spento. Buon pomeriggio, signore e signori deputate e deputati.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, members of Parliament. Thank you for gathering here today to speak about Iran. First of all, let me thank the chair of the committee, Laura Boldrini, for having been so close to us, not only in the past year, but for always supporting us in our non-violent fight for freedom and democracy of the Iranian people. For over 44 years in Iran, apartheid has been underway, and it's gender-based. The first law that was amended and then made null and void in Iran following the establishment of the new Islamic government in 1979 was entitled the Protection of the Family, and it provided Iranian women with a number of rights. The first category to be affected after the so-called Islamic Revolution in 1979 was precisely women. Women who, for over a century, have been fighting for their own rights, starting with the right to education. Suffice it to consider that in the early 1900s up until 1906, in Iran, women did not have the right to education, as happens in Afghanistan today. The first girls' schools were established in spite of the fact that they were greatly opposed by the Shiite clergy at the time, and this was done by the first Iranian feminists who belonged to the aristocracy of the time and therefore had been educated. Since that time, Iranian women have greatly bet and invested in education at the university level especially, and that's why today in civil society more women are educated than men. We have more women graduates than more women than men. There are more women that speak several languages, but unfortunately they live in a misogynist society, and one that is liberticide, and not just for women but for the entire population, especially for ethnic, religious, and gender minorities. In such a context, women over the past 44 years have tried to find some space in the Iranian society. And of course, they've been greatly hindered by the laws that were introduced in 1979 and that tend to consider women as the ownership of men, as second-class citizens. And that's why it is quite admirable to see what Iranian women have managed to do over the past years. And they've become the protagonists of a great change that is going on in Iran. This has been underway for many decades, not since September of last year, but the whole world has actually taken notice of the power of the nonviolent fight of Iranian women just recently. My colleagues will tell you how Iranian women, one step at a time, have managed to become the true engine for change in Iran up until that tragic day of September 16th, 2022, when the young Kurdish woman, Iranian Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, died following an arrest by the so-called moral police. This is an experience that all the women that I know, including myself, have been subjected to. We know exactly what she went through because we know how women are treated in the so-called women's rehabilitation centers imposed by the Islamic regime. So since September 16th of last year, there's been a growing protest in many cities. The slogan is women, life, and freedom. And we've been able to actually bring that to the global scene. For the very first time, the voice of Iranian women and other women, too, has been heard throughout the world, because what is called the fight of Iranian women for the protection of their body and their freedom is actually intersectional, because it was especially men over the past few years who have given up their privileges by supporting women in their fight. And this is the true sea change in Iranian society. It's a change in social and political paradigm, which is completely unprecedented, and that's why we call it a revolution. We know it's not a real revolution, but it's a nonviolent revolution, a revolution in terms of women's, but also men's awareness in a society that in 1979 was very traditionalist, patriarchal, and religious. But in these past 44 years, great leaps forward have been taken, and Iran has become one of the most progressive countries, one of the most educated in the region, in spite of all the laws that exist. There are two Irans. So one is the Iran of civil society, which is very young and educated and progressive. And then we have those that for over 44 years have led the country and that have a certain interpretation of Islamic laws. And they use this as a power tool in order to impose their own power upon every individual citizen, especially women, but also gender minorities, like the LGBTQ plus community, which is very discriminated against in Iran. But in spite of that, it is able to operate through underground organizations that sometimes are dismantled. This also applies to anybody who is involved socially and creates awareness in the country. We're talking about many, many categories, as, for example, environmentalists. A lot of them are in jail simply because they provided information on how to practice environmental awareness in Iran, how to put out fires in forests, and this is something that the regime should be dealing with, actually, or NGOs that deal with labor and children and in the underprivileged classes and the most remote regions where there's no water, education, or power. Often, these NGOs are led by women, and they're trying to do their best, really, to elevate the quality of life of those groups. And they're constantly persecuted, arrested, and condemned with false accusations. They are accused of espionage or having relations with hostile governments. This also holds true for other categories like reporters. There's a case of two young reporters who basically disclosed the news of the death of Mahsa Amini, and also some covered the funeral of Mahsa Amini, not to mention the families of victims. There have been more than 600 protesters and activists who were killed in their protests. and their families are greatly threatened by the authorities. They're being threatened not to speak about what happened to their children. There have also been 7 capital executions, death penalties and executions. We're talking about people who have been executed with absolutely no legal assistance. Over a very short period of time, they were convicted and killed. There were also actors and movie directors who are banned from working simply because they spoke out against the regime. Some of them are in jail. In the face of these great violations of human rights, what the Iranian population is asking for is simply not to legitimate this regime. The regime has lost its legitimacy in the eyes of most of the population. For too many years, these totalitarian regimes have killed and raped peaceful protesters. They've been tolerated in the name of interest, but the time has come for the voice of the Iranian people to be heard so that these regimes can no longer be tolerated or legitimated, because the fight of Iranian women and men is not only for democracy, it's a fight that we must all support if we cherish democracy and freedom. Together, we must stand on the right side of history, on the side of women, freedom, and life. Thank you so much, Dr. Nazari, for illustrating the situation of women, minorities, and all those who try to respond to the needs of the most vulnerable in your country. And now I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Pegamo Shipur.
Sì, è da remoto, sì, è da remoto. Prego, dottor.
She's speaking to us virtually.
Grazie mille, rinnovo i ringraziamenti, è davvero un momento molto importante.
Thank you. Today is a very important event for us against this media-based silence. We need to know what is presently happening in Iran. Were it not for the social media, we would not be informed about what is going on in Iran, and knowing how facts unfold, knowing about the truth. It is very important to share this truth. We know that conventional Iranian media give fake news or distorted reality, which is something which very often happens when it comes to dictatorships, whereas we want to speak the truth. And it is very hard for us because, of course, we're very grateful to the very good work that is European Parliament is doing, but regrettably sanctions have not been enough, even sanctions against the people, because there is a constant exchange of information between also between the Italian embassy and Iran. We see constant meetings with Italian and Iranian businessmen, and now these meetings should no longer happen because these meetings are violating or going against what is actually the daily life that unfolds in Iran, because this feeds into the economic power of the regime, Iranian regime. 1 month from now, we will have the social forum. The social forum would be chaired by an Iranian ambassador. I think that we should not lower the guard. In other words, we should advise people not to do business with these dictators. History shows that when economy collapses, automatically the power of these people will collapse, and hence also their power of the capability of wielding power in the region. We see that in Iran, the relations with China, Russia, and Venezuela are being enhanced, and these are countries which we know very well, and we know that they are cutting edge in terms of technology, and they're offering to Iran new technologies to be even more far-reaching in cracking down on the people. 4 apps have been now been deleted, and these apps were used to monitor people. And so we need more ethically decent and righteous people when it comes to the use of these new technologies. So we have to work on communication for those who are provide these services, and we should advise these people to freeze any economic relations with Iran, because this would mean losing other lives because of this. So we have to be on the right ethical side of history, and so we hope that also this issue will be addressed. The role of Italy and the EU are very important in this field. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we will delve into this Mediterranean dialogue. You're saying that it will be chaired by an Iranian person. We will check that with our Foreign Affairs Ministry, because we fully share your concern, and we will try and check how this meeting will be held. And now I will give the floor to Shadi Alizadeh, who is representative of Italo-Iranian Union for Women and Freedom. Thank you. Thank you. I would like to thank all the delegates for being here today and for giving us the opportunity to talk about a reality history which is not only based on territorial culture and tradition, but which is based on the universal principle of rights of women. The gender equality and respecting women's rights is the very basis of an even more comprehensive request, which is democracy and freedom, which for 44 years now, but which September 16, 2022, all Iranian people in Iran and across the world are advocating in all countries and cities. It is very important to recognize, to acknowledge these rights of women, and this adds value to the movement, women freedom, woman life freedom. Rights of women are to be seen only as a right of minorities, a part of the population. What Iran is actually telling us is that freedom and empowerment of women are the very basis of any democratic process and of protection of women's rights. Ever since 1979, based this, and I would like to stress the word cultural process, Iran regime has identified as enemies of morality students, protesters, professors, intellectuals, and they have identified as their primary enemy woman, and within the profile of a woman in Iran, which has a thousands-old tradition based on Persian tradition. He has also included LGBTQ+, other ethnic minorities, religious minorities who live in Iran. And within this context, there's a universal process. This universal process is the process of domineering over these people, which is in conflict with the role of women. I would like to refer to a motto, a slogan, which dates back to 44 years ago, which has been upheld by women. In spite of my injured body, I will flourish. I've been judged because I'm a woman. So the negative perception that people have just because of women is a cultural heritage which also has an influence on international relations. So this is what my friends and colleagues were just saying. a while ago. This movement is looked upon as a secondary movement, a movement which does not have a primary value when it comes to trade relations, when it comes to economic power. And this is why, up until last year, the Islamic Republic of Iran was in the member of the UN Committee in terms of protection of women's rights. Now, this movement, ever since September 16, has been disseminated across the world. So many other people have joined this movement. Women, life, freedom, and the empowerment and the acknowledgement of democracy, as we believe in democracy, must not be polluted by this patriarchal dogma where we are looked upon as subjects to a culture, to an abusive culture. And it is within this context that the Iranian Republic of Iran, in face of these events, in September 2023, has issued this law that Laura Boldrin was referring to, which has made sanctions even harder for women who do not wear this veil, which is a symbol of culture. And sanctions go all the way up to 10 years of detention for the woman who does not wear the veil in public areas, or the reduction of the salary for women who, when at work, refuse to wear the veil, and who refuse to being considered as subdued to a patriarchal culture, but also sanctions for those who do not report them to the police. So there's this new culture of, I mean, all citizens are responsible for this, for reporting to the police those who are not wearing the veil. So those who do not report to the police the improper use of a free woman will be punished. They may lose their job. They will have to pay a fine, and so the fault of our sisters is incitation to prostitution and moral corruption. Our only fault is of being a woman, and as women, we are looked upon as the outcasts, the marginated. So therefore, LGBT plus, ethnic minorities, discrimination, or simply the fact that gender is no longer looked upon as one specific category. I mean, people who just want to feel free to live their life as they wish.
Una violazione.
That is why we are crying out against the violation of human rights, universal human rights, not just women's human rights throughout the world. Here we have the requests of the Iranian community and the community of Iranians living here in Italy. So we ask that Parliament, the Italian Parliament, and this committee in particular, gradually and significantly decrease diplomatic exchanges with the representatives of the regimes, and also look into the use of torture instrument of Pasaran and the full removal of the responses against those that protest against the regime, condemn the practice of regime to block internet during the protests underway, which makes it possible for people to exchange information freely amongst themselves. Commit to allow the Iranian people to have access to internet free of charge in spite of the regime's censorship. Identify the propaganda practiced by the regime, counter the disinformation and hate campaigns and other efforts to control the public opinion, aimed at diminishing the violation of human rights by the regime and its embassies against the diaspora living in Europe, protect the diaspora against the transnational repression of the regime, release visas to those who have the founded fear of being persecuted for having upheld their rights in relation to the protests in Iran, counter and denounce the lobbies, recognize the Islamic Republic as a dictatorial regime that systematically violates human rights and those of women, send a consular political staff that is specialized to monitor the appropriate oversight of political prisoners in Iran. This is a resistance that sees us united throughout the world, and it's a resistance that doesn't only see women as the main protagonists, but also men, our families, our members that don't see in this patriarchal culture their beacons, so they themselves are the first victims of this regime. It is necessary for all political forces internationally to take on our requests. It is our task, and that's why we're here, as Italian and European citizens, to indeed resound the song of freedom of the people of Iran. We do this for us all, for peace and democracy, and as ever, here for women, life, and freedom everywhere. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alizadeh. The list of your requests and claims is extremely clear. We'll see how we're going to be able to take them on board. I would now like to give the floor to Dr. Zara Ghazali, who represents the Association of Iranian Free Women. Good afternoon, Chair. Thank you to the members of the committee, and thank you for meeting with us this afternoon. My colleagues, those who have spoken before me, spoke very eloquently about the violation of human rights in Iran. I'd like to go into more specific terms and tell you what happens in Iran through the systematic violation of the rights of citizens. Iran, back in 1924, ratified the Declaration of Children's Rights, and in 1949, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Some basic rights are enshrined in the Constitution approved on December 3rd, 1979, right after the Islamic Revolution. Although, of course, there are specific rights and to be enjoyed by citizens, these are often violated. Here, I'd like to allude to some rights of our Constitution. Article 12 states that the religion of the Islamic Republic is Shiite Islam. In Article 13, it is stated that the Zoroastrian, Jewish, and Christian minorities are recognized, while the Baha'i denomination is not, and the faithful of this religion are discriminated against and persecuted. For example, they are banned access to public universities, and they cannot be hired as civil servants. In Article 19, it is stated that there should be ethnic equality. And it should be specified here that in Iran, there are about 7 different ethnic groups that live together peacefully and speak different languages, whereas the governors of Kurdistan and of another region are not elected by the people who live in that region or those regions. And that is because they need to have greater control by the government. because according to the Islamic regime, these regions that are bordering are always threats. Article 20 states that there is equality between men and women, according to Islam. In Article 23, it is stated that there should be freedom of expression. Nobody should be convicted or persecuted just because they have expressed an idea that is different from that of others. But we see the opposite. We see that protesters and we see that people who oppose the Islamic regime are arrested and they are raped and incarcerated. In Article 24, it is stated that there should be freedom of the press. We know that the Iranian press is under censorship, and the press that publishes news in the country is shut down, and the reporters are arrested and detained. In the specific case, El Maria and Mehdi, the two journalists who published the killing of Masa Amini, have been in an isolation shell in prison for over a year. They have no right to see their family, and they do not have access to their trusted lawyers. Zara Karimi, who is Iranian and Canadian, she's a reporter. In the year 2000, she was killed after torture because she was accused of espionage. In Article 25, it is allowed to wiretap citizens. So the Islamic regime can officially wiretap its citizens and have control over all communication. Article 26 establishes the freedom to found parties and political as well and other associations. But in 1998 and in 2005, during the reformist government, many NGOs were established in Iran. Unfortunately, however, most of the individuals that worked in these NGOs were persecuted and the NGOs were shut down. There was a campaign, for example, of over 1,000 signatures against discrimination of the LGBTQ plus community. This was established by a number of activists. The idea of the campaign was to collect 1 million signatures to then go to Parliament and demand the abolition of discriminatory measures against women. But in spite of this, a lot of women were arrested and many had to leave the country, including the Nobel laureate of 2004. Article 35 establishes freedom to choose a trusted lawyer. We saw in recent events that there were protesters who were arrested and they were denied the right to choose their trusted lawyer because, unfortunately, the Bar Association has lost its independence, and lawyers and advocates are arrested and they are detained together with their clients. And ex officio lawyers who are assigned to protesters are actually hired by the Ministry of Justice, and they work for the Ministry of Justice. Article 38 states that it is not possible to torture, and we see that this is a right that is absolutely denied. We, I think, have all heard of forced confessions that are broadcasted by state TV. Article 39 talks about the respect for human dignity vis-a-vis the detained, the arrested, and those in exile. But this, too, is not respected. Actually, protesters, and especially women protesters, are subjected to violence, and especially sexual violence. So the first thing that these people are deprived of is human dignity. Let's now, yes, I'm sure, unfortunately, we have very little time. We need to finish by 3, and I'm sure colleagues have a lot of questions. The death penalty and capital punishment, according to the criminal code. According to the annual report of Iran Human Rights in 2022, 588 executions were performed, and that's 271 more versus the previous year. Of these people, 16 were women. There's also amputation of limbs. And if a person, after being condemned 3 times, commits a crime, they are hung. There's been an abolition of the rights of the family. There is such a measure as a temporary wedding or marriage, which actually allows men to marry women on a temporary basis from 1 hour to 99 years. And men are therefore off the hook, so to speak. And there needs to be a formal authorization of the spouse for women to be able to work. The life of women is worth half of that of men, and this also happens in the area of inheritance and succession. Now, once all of this is abolished, there will be no trace left of a regime that systematically violates the rights of their citizens. Thank you.
Dottoressa.
Thank you very much. And now we will give the floor to Perna Canati, who is another member of the Women Life Freedom movement.
I'm deeply honored to stand before this distinguished assembly today as a representative of Associazione Donna Vita Libertà. Our organization comprises a diverse cross-section of Iranian community residing in Italy, all bound by a common vision for a better Iran. Over the last year, we have taken a leading role in organizing protests and rallies across Italy, passionately advocating for a secular and democratic Iran. We firmly believe in the importance of government that upholds democratic principles, regardless of its specific form. After 44 years of living under the shadow of the Islamic regime dictatorship, a pivotal turning point emerged after the tragic death of Mahsa Amini. Iranians collectively declared enough is enough and we want regime change. The Islamic regime in Iran has left a trail of destruction that extends far beyond words and concepts. It has systematically dismantled nearly every facet of our society. When I say everything, I really mean it, everything. And our economy has been decimated, our industries are crippled, and our environment ravaged. The regime impact knows no bounds, affecting education, healthcare, human rights, and countless other aspects of our lives. It has left no stone unturned. And its destructive influence has left lasting scars on our beloved Iran. And now we find ourselves at a critical moment in history. Women in Iran shown remarkable courage, standing at the front line of the revolution for justice and freedom, bearing the brunt of the regime operation. Nevertheless, their fight is not isolated, as men have stood alongside them. Rouzbeh Khademian, a young man, declared, "I'm willing to sacrifice my life so that you can enjoy freedom." Tragically, he paid ultimate price with his life. Reaching this belief is only achievable through the achievement of the collective wisdom of society. We believe the initial spark of this revolution came from the awareness of our young people. While the Islamic Republic allocates a significant part of its annual budget to fuel its propaganda machine, an organization like Morality Police get much more funding than our emergency medical service. And And schools work tirelessly to brainwash the mind of our youth, and there's limited access to the internet. Something surprising happened. These young individuals stood up against the regime control. High school girls fearlessly threw away their scarf and headscarf and threw the pictures of Islamic regime's leader in the garbage. It's no wonder that schools have become a place where the regime punishes these young people. Chemical attacks on schools have poisoned the students and led some of them to death. In March alone, at least 270 schools in the country faced chemical attacks. And victims were children, students under 18. This regime fears this unstoppable generation proudly chanting women, life, freedom. Sarina Ismailzadeh, a 16-year-old girl killed by regime, expressed the aspiration of the generation. What do young Iranians desire? Welfare, welfare, and welfare. These words reflect the aspiration of a generation who knows the importance of the citizen dignity and refuse to be silenced. Apart from the school, university were under a stronghold of Iranian youth. Protests escalated with universities. More than 3,126 students and 31 professors of universities have been disciplined in various ways, such as summoning, banning from entering the university, academic suspension, and expulsion. In the past year, due to their participation in peaceful protests and demonstrations. It's remarkable to see such a strong desire for freedom in a country that Islamic regime has transformed it into a massive jail. Maybe that's where the mystery lies. No authoritarian government in history has endured forever, and Islamic regime knows that none of its strategy in Iran is yielding result anymore, and these are its last gasps. Through the massacres and suspicion, it tries to buy itself a little more time. In conclusion, I'd like to pose some questions and some demands. How can we prevent Italian companies from doing business with Islamic regime? Is it possible to reduce or cut ties between Italy and the Islamic regime's embassy? What steps can be taken to recognize the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, as a terrorist organization, and how can we help? And the last question is regarding Iran's representative, Ali Bahraini, heading the Social Forum Assembly of the United Nations Human Rights Council scheduled in November 2nd or 3rd in Geneva. Don't you think this decision undermines the credibility and dignity of UN and Western powers and humiliates the people of Iran? And what action can address this concern? Thank you very much.
Sì, grazie veramente. Abbiamo ascoltato audizioni di grande spessore, importanza, donne professioniste impegnate per il loro paese, diverse generazioni. Mi ha fatto molto piacere anche la composizione di questa delegazione. Adesso io chiederei ai colleghi e alle colleghe di fare domande. Vedo che la collega onorevole Quartapelle vorrebbe la parola. Prego.
Grazie, ringrazio molto la Presidente per aver organizzato questa audizione a un anno dalle proteste di Massamini, e credo che la varietà degli interventi ci dia un'idea molto chiara della varietà e della ricchezza anche dell'opposizione iraniana in esilio e della diaspora iraniana in Italia in particolare, quindi ringrazio molto le audite. Io ho una questione che riguarda alcune sollecitazioni che ci vengono dai vostri network, cioè la condizione delle ragazze che sono scappate, in particolare quelle che si trovano in Turchia, ma non solo, che hanno magari un legame con il nostro paese e che chiedono di poter venire in Italia per avere insomma, lo status come rifugiate. Se potete darci conto di questa situazione, sono varie situazioni, e di come sta andando l'interlocuzione con il Ministero degli Esteri da questo punto di vista, e che cosa si può migliorare da questo punto di di vista. Non stiamo parlando di milioni di ragazze iraniane, stiamo parlando di alcuni casi puntuali che alcune di voi seguono o di cui sono a conoscenza, e credo che questa Commissione, per essere anche poi operativa non solo sulla politica, non solo diciamo sulle linee di politica estera su cui discutiamo spesso con il Ministro, ma anche proprio per la protezione dei difensori e delle difensore dei diritti umani, ecco, potete darci magari qualche input per migliorare il nostro lavoro e per essere più efficaci.
Aspettiamo magari altre domande, poi si risponde insieme. Non so se ci sono altre. Collega Vicepresidente Loperfido, prego.
Io Presidente ringrazio e mi congratulo per la forte volontà da parte degli ospiti. L'invito a continuare anche a partecipare a questi incontri per diffondere quanto loro stanno facendo, con l'obiettivo appunto di avere sempre maggior forza con la condivisione di istituzioni come la nostra, quindi semplicemente questo.
Grazie. Allora, se non ci sono altre domande, io ripasserei la parola.
Thank you. And if you want to answer the question.
Potrei?
Sì, brevemente. Thank you. We had a number of experience with young girls who are based in Turkey, where no visas is requested. So those who flee the country, they often go to Turkey. In Turkey, laws are very harsh against those who stay for more than 3 months, and the procedure to be followed for asylum-seeking people is very time-consuming. The situation is especially difficult when it comes to these people, because one of the things that would happen after the protest from last September was shooting in the very eyes of these young protesters with a paintball, and these students had to were held liable vis-a-vis the government, and they had to flee the country because of what happened. Some of them are still in Turkey. 2 of them are now in Italy, but it is very hard for them to access this visa. It was really very hard for them. There's been a number of Italians and Iranians who live in Italy who have really shown much solidarity to help out these people. Some of them are now in Germany, whereas others are still based in Turkey. We're not talking about protesters who have been turned blind because they've been shot at, but we also have other Iranians who risk being condemned. And some of these Iranians have left the country. Some of them have been arrested in Turkey because they participated in some of these rallies. And we've always asked for the support of the Italian Foreign Affairs Ministry to offer a safe refuge for these young people who they cannot go back to their home country because they risk going through summary trials and being executed. Does anyone want to add something? Thank you. As Nazari just said, we had the first case of a woman who has been subject to harsh sanctions because she participated in this rally, and we had a number of difficulties, and it was very hard for them to ask for this visa for the protesters who were based in Turkey. So it is not easy to come up with the demand for a visa with the Italian consular office. Very often the conditions was very complicated for those who are based in Turkey, they are in safe areas, but they cannot leave the country. They cannot leave the country because they have a special relation with Iran. So in this case, there's this tacit agreement of repatriation with Iran. So some of the victims who have died in case of summary executions, these people were actually coming back. We've been repatriated from Turkey. So some young people we found rubber bullets in the bodies of these young students, and they could have access. They had access to Germany, and so they were granted this visa. And we had some difficulties in obtaining these visas because, of course, we had to do this very swiftly. So one of the things we asked was for the granting of visas, which we asked that basically for these visas, they could ask for international protection, and so the whole process would be simplified. And our community has been subject to a number of attacks and criticism because we asked for this mechanism for this international universal right. We still have a large number of cases of people who are based in Turkey, as we just said. So it is very important to these people to offer them a way out. And also to acknowledge their fight for freedom.
Aggiungere qualche altra cosa?
Is there anything else? Yes, thank you. With regard to the cases of these young women, especially the activists in Turkey, there are activists who did not leave after the protests of September 2022. There are some who left Iran before for different reasons, mostly because of discrimination on the job. And in Turkey, they were able to secure a permit, a residence permit. For some of them, the permit has expired, but in the meantime, they had applied to Italian universities for entry. The problem they came up against is that when applying for a visa, they were asked to produce their residence permit in Turkey, but because they could not renew the residence permit in Turkey, most of them indeed are arrested and detained and then repatriated with no reason at all. So they were blocked in Turkey. Although they were admitted and they had a scholarship at a university in Italy, they weren't able to go.
Sì, sì.
Scusatemi, se posso aggiungere un'altra cosa,
If I might add something, we also are seeing sporadic cases in which the embassy of the Islamic Republic doesn't renew passports for those who have a visa in Italy. So students and professionals who are here under a study visa, their passport is not renewed by the embassy, so they're here in a limbo. They're very vulnerable, and often these are students. There were also instructions not to participate in protests in Italy to commemorate the 16th of September. Otherwise, there would be problems for their visas. Okay, well, since we are in Parliament, we need to have specific requirements or requests. First of all, let me just say that when you were talking about the social forum, this is the social forum 2023 of the Human Rights Council of the UN. It's going to be held on November 2nd and 3rd, 2023, and it's going to focus on science, technology, innovation, and human rights. So the chair is the Iranian ambassador, and given the violations of human rights that have been perpetrated by the Iranian regime, it would be truly absurd not to have an expression of protest by the government when it comes to this appointment, because the fact that Iran rejected international vaccines was truly absurd. And that was followed by repression when Mahsa Amini was murdered. So I think that as a committee, maybe we could draw attention to this frightening designation, and we could say that we cannot forge ahead because of all the implications. With regard to the visas, it would be very useful to receive a list of situations in order for us to be able to forward that to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Did you want to intervene? Yes, Mr. Amendola. Yes, I was really interested in this whole affair of passports, because nobody can go back to Iran if their passports expired and they're not renewed. And Chair, I think that we need to do something because they become refugees in spite of their age. So I would really look into that kind of violation. Yes, that they won't let them leave. Yeah, definitely. Okay. So it would be important to have specific information regarding this in order for us to write a letter and devise a specific initiative to solve the situation on a humanitarian level as well. I'd like to thank you very kindly, and we will try to follow up these two issues specifically. And then as far as the rest is concerned, I think you should always make your requests, not just in Parliament, but with government too, because it's only fair for your demands to be heard, especially by those who can respond and who can take action in the substance. Thank you very much, and we will continue to monitor the situation in Iran. Thank you.